Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We may have dodged a bullet, but we're still getting a punch to the economic gut.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
From the Rose Garden of the White House, President Donald Trump announcing his reciprocal tariffs on 185 countries around the world. Each country hit with a different amount. They ranged from 10% tariffs on imports to close to 50%. But this list was missing a notable pair. The closest trading partners with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico received exemptions. While many were breathing a sigh of relief with the news, our auto sector was actually winded.
We will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles.
It's seen as devastating news for our industry, and the next day, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded.
By matching the U.S. approach with 25% tariffs on all vehicles imported from the United States that are not compliant with CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement, and on the non-Canadian content of CUSMA-compliant vehicles from the United States as well. Our tariffs, though, unlike the U.S. tariffs, will not affect auto parts.
You'll be forgiven if you're having trouble keeping track of all the tariffs and exemptions that we're facing right now because, let's face it, it's not easy. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Richard Forbes, a principal economist with the Conference Board of Canada, who's going to help break this all down for us and talk about the impacts of Trump's trade war on our country. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So for months, President Trump has been talking about tariffs, either threatening them, implementing them, backtracking on them, giving exemptions. It's no surprise that some people feel a little bit lost in this conversation. So lay it out for us. Let us know the tariffs that Canada's facing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So for Canada specifically, the tariffs that are in effect are the tariffs on steel and aluminum products, first and foremost, that were in effect as of March 12th. So that's still on the table. That's still in effect. And then as of today, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles headed south of the border. So to our understanding, it's the non-U.S. content of Canadian final vehicles going to the U.S. In terms of parts, which is a big part of the concern as well, there's no tariffs on it yet, but the U.S. does plan to impose those a little further down the line.
Yeah, because they don't have a process at this point to really determine how much of an auto part is American, Canadian, or Mexican.
Yeah, that's correct. And it goes back to what, everyone's been saying is that there's not really a such thing as a Canadian or a US made car because the parts, they cross the border multiple times, 6-7 times on average before going to final assembly. So it's a very complicated matter for them to figure out.
And then, of course, there are those initial tariffs that started it all, the fentanyl-related tariffs, that is 25% on all goods. However, the Trump administration ended up giving an exemption for USMCA trade, correct?
Yes, my apologies. Yeah, so they did exempt the USMCA goods. And so that is the lion's share of Canadian exports. So, to the most degree, we are safe from that still. As the U.S. unveiled their reciprocal measures yesterday, Canada and U.S. were left off entirely.
You guys have been looking into the impacts of this trade war. What are the impacts of the tariffs that we've already seen, and what can we expect moving forward with these new auto tariffs?
Yeah, the impacts, from our perspective, the uncertainty of the tariffs is creating really negative economic impacts. So we track consumer sentiment each month to see how Canadian households are feeling. And that actually reached its lowest level on record outside of the pandemic, beginning days of the pandemic, just last month. So that's a sign that even though the tariffs weren't in play, just the uncertainty is really concerning for households. So we see households, pulling back on spending, increasing precautionary savings, And even from a business standpoint, the uncertainty is really, pushing investment plans down the road as firms try to figure out what's going to happen.
And on the tariffs themselves, are they hitting companies already rather than just the uncertainty around them?
Yeah, absolutely. There is some impact there that we've seen just since the March 12th with the steel and aluminum. Some manufacturers in Quebec that manufacture aluminum products are already scaling back production. The steel industry, was concentrated in Hamilton. I think there's maybe some disruptions there, although I'm not totally clear on those at this time. So even though they've only been in play for a couple of weeks, we're already seeing some early impacts.
Yeah, and then Stellantis as well, putting a 2-week pause on operations, at least a 2-week pause on operations after the auto tariffs took effect. Could we see more of that? And how many jobs could be impacted by all of these tariffs? How many more people could be out of work within days or weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. So Stellantis, as you mentioned, announced a pause on production for 2 to 3 weeks, I believe it was. I think there was 3,200 workers that they said could be impacted by the shutdown. And then, if we ended up seeing widespread tariffs across the Canadian economy, our thing is that we could see up to 160,000 jobs lost across the Canadian economy. And I will disclaim that's kind of a higher estimate. That's based on if all goods faced a 25% tariff. But still, it's still a concerning situation nonetheless. And it goes back to what we've all been saying this time is that in the auto industry, these tariffs would lead to pretty immediate effects. So the tariffs came into effect this morning, and right away we saw Stellantis cut back on production.
And in the days ahead, do you expect other companies to potentially make operational shifts as well?
Yeah, especially in the automotive sector. We think Stellantis is just the first to make these announcements. And, it's important to note also that the production cuts, they were also in Mexico. And there's also 900 workers in the U.S. that are affected by these cuts as well. So it's already hurting the U.S. economy. It's not just in Canada. But yes, to answer your question, going forward, we do see further cuts in the auto sector soon.
So let's focus a little bit on a tariff that we're actually not being hit with. The president has announced these global reciprocal tariffs on most countries around the world, however, not for Canada and Mexico. Even though we have an exemption from those, how will the global trade war that the U.S. is launching right now impact Canada and our economy?
There's no doubt that this is a big day. It's the launching of a global trade war. And we see economic growth across the globe slowing down considerably. This could lead to a global recession. And ultimately, that's going to hurt Canada. There's going to be less demand for Canadian goods, even outside the U.S. So it's pretty dire situation that we're still unpacking.
So you're still trying to crunch the numbers to figure out the economic impact for Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the reciprocal tariffs were larger than most experts and analysts were even expecting. The calculation was based on a very crude measure of the trade deficit that the U.S. has with other countries. So we're looking at 90% for some Asian countries, China at around 60%, much larger than most people were even expecting.
Even though it's not Canada who's placing these reciprocal tariffs on these countries, we still do a lot of trade with those countries. Maybe getting items like clothing made in Vietnam, let's say. How will consumers feel the impact of the U.S. Taking on almost all other countries in the world with these larger tariffs?
Yeah, well, a lot of goods are shipped from these countries like Cambodia or Vietnam that are going to face the really high tariffs. They're shipped to the U.S. And they might go through some sort of final finishing process or something, and then get shipped to Canada as its final destination. So. I think we could expect to see Canada face higher prices for, some clothing, certainly, different apparel, I think would be the biggest, at least biggest immediate impact.
All right. And China, also a massive producer of goods that a lot of Canadians utilize, everything from, kitchen utensils to toys.
Yeah, absolutely. And, China is another one. But it's important to note it's only, if the goods somehow get passed through the U.S. For some other sort of production line, will it affect Canada? So that, make no mistake about it, the biggest impact is, a negative one for the U.S. rather than on Canada in terms of prices.
We'll have more on the big story with Richard Forbes, Principal Economist with the Conference Board of Canada, speaking to me about the latest U.S. tariffs and how it's impacting Canada in just a moment. So, Richard, on top of the tariffs that we're already facing, of course, President Trump always likes to keep something hanging over our heads, and the White House has signaled that they are looking at new tariffs on sectors like our lumber, our pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. So, if those tariffs go ahead, how much will that hurt?
Yeah, it's going to be a difficult situation. And that, after the news yesterday, a lot of Canadian industries are breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief. But as you mentioned, the threat's still there, and especially for industries like lumber or dairy, for example. These are big Canadian industries that President Trump has singled out before. So if they end up putting tariffs on lumber, for example, with lumber in particular, we don't see the U.S. actually being able to meet their own demand for lumber internally. So I think the Canadian lumber industry will be okay in the short term, though he is promising to open up a lot of the forest land in the U.S. to try to meet this demand. So the grand scheme of things, yeah, it's a difficult situation, and we're just hopeful that some cooler heads will prevail around these industries.
While we're on this note, Trump has made many claims about trade with Canada, so maybe you can help clear the air here. He's claimed that Canada has, I think sometimes he said 270% tariffs on dairy, 300%. I think one time he even said 400%. But he's also claimed that the U.S. subsidizes Canada overall to the tune of $200 billion, which may be an apparent reference to our trade deficit. Let's do some fact checking here. Are either of those claims true? And what is the real situation there when it comes to dairy and our trade deficit?
Yeah, in terms of dairy, Canada does impose tariffs, as high on some products, as high as the president's claiming on dairy products coming from the U.S. to Canada. But the big caveat there is it's only if the imports go over a certain threshold. So Canada actually never hits that threshold. So we protect the Canadian dairy industry by putting a quota on American dairy, where if it goes over a certain quota, then the tariffs do get up to the 200-300% range for some dairy products. But again, we never hit that quota, so the tariffs don't actually come into effect. So it's a bit of a misguided approach by President Trump there.
What about the trade deficit figure, $200 billion? It doesn't seem like it's accurate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Based on our calculations and other analyst calculations, the U.S. is actually in a trade surplus with Canada if you remove Canadian energy. And that's energy that they rely on for their own refineries. A lot of the American oil refineries, for example, are set up specifically for the Canadian heavy oil. So it's not actually a negative for the U.S. And, more broadly, the trade deficit that President Trump is concerned about is actually just a reflection of the U.S. economy being much wealthier than a lot of countries and buying more of these goods. So as we see tariffs in countries like Vietnam go really high, that's because they're producing a lot of goods cheaply that get shipped to the U.S. because the U.S. can actually afford them. So it's a very misguided approach what is happening here.
And President Trump's own U.S. trade representative, his office pegs the trade deficit at $63 billion. And as you point out, that's mainly due to energy purchases from the U.S. One thing I did want to talk about, though, as well, is the renegotiation of our economic deal. Prime Minister Mark Carney says during his phone call with President Trump last week, the two leaders agreed that Canada and the U.S. should negotiate some sort of new economic and security deal moving forward. The conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, in the election campaign says that on day one, he would try to renegotiate CUSMA, our trade deal. So how do you think these negotiations will look like? given the way President Trump has treated this whole trade war during his second term in office?
Our view is that there's going to be some sort of deal renegotiated, and likely there's going to be some tariffs additional from what we've already seen on Canadian goods. That's just our guess. We obviously don't know how it's going to unfold. But one big part of the renegotiation, in our view, is going to be around Canada's defense spending, which President Trump has mentioned several times. And it's not just around the border and fentanyl, it's around Canada's military spending, which sits well below the NATO targets. All NATO allies have a commitment to meet a certain threshold of spending on their military, and Canada ranks near the bottom of all these allies. So we think that military spending is going to be a big part of the negotiation here.
And what will the U.S. be looking for besides military spending? How might they target Canada and try and either open up our market, get more access, fix this deficit that Trump keeps talking about?
Yeah, I think they're going to try to open up the Canadian dairy industry, which is, under supply management in Canada. But Prime Minister Carney recently stated that that's the red line. That's the red tape. That's not going to happen. So we're going to have to see how that shakes out, because I think President Trump's very adamant about that. And then also it's going back to lumber. Canadian provinces, they charge a fee for companies to extract lumber before they ship it to the U.S., which we think it will be another contentious issue for the countries to work out.
And do you see this being CUSMA renegotiated, or is it going to be something entirely different?
Yeah, well, our view is that, we still think there's a lot on the table here between the two countries. So it might not just be around trade itself. There are concerns a couple months ago that the president might want some sort of mineral deal with Canada. And maybe even Mexico. Defense spending, as we mentioned, is another thing that might actually be part of the deal. So we don't know, obviously, but it could end up being something that's a lot bigger than just a deal around tariffs and trade.
There's been some talk about Canada teaming up with some like-minded allies to create a new sort of economic coalition without the U.S. Does that make sense for us? Would that work? Or because of our geography, are there going to be difficulties with things like trade?
Well, we do see opportunities, certainly, and this has been our big message, is actually, regardless of what happens with the U.S. trade deal, Canada needs to start diversifying. It's a partner that can no longer be trusted. So we do see big opportunities in places like Europe, and a lot of countries in Asia as well. As you mentioned, the transportation costs might be high. So it's not something that would be fixed overnight, but it's certainly something that we do see big potential, and longer term, we need to think about it, more access to these markets.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for your thoughts on all of this. Really appreciate it.
All right, great. Thanks very much for having me.
That was Richard Forbes, a principal economist with the Conference Board of Canada, speaking with me about the tariffs that Canada faces from the U.S., the tariff threats that still hang over our heads, and the impact this is having on our economy. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.